So, what I was going to talk about today, I think, was a little bit timely. And given that today is Good Friday and this is Easter weekend, um, I pulled some material from this book. It's by Adyashanti, who's a spiritual teacher with a Zen Buddhist background. It's called Resurrecting Jesus. In case any of you are interested in delving deeper in this. And what Adyashanti does is he takes the life of Jesus and different stages of his life, and he talks about how that's a metaphor for spiritual awakening. And so I wanted to kind of go through some of these different stages. Right? But one of the things that we all know, they say there's two certainties about life: death, and the other we always hear about is taxes, but really it's suffering. Trials, shit happens in our lives. Pain happens in our lives. None of us are immune from pain. None of us are immune from experiencing pain of any sort. It could be the loss of someone, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the loss of money. And in part, this is kind of apropos because of what's taking place now around the world. We have a coronavirus going around that is really causing a great upheaval in how we live our lives. To the point that many groups, spiritual groups and religious organizations are needing to find alternative methods for meeting, such as this. It's changing the nature of work. And for those with children, children are home, which puts undue stress on parents who still have to contend with their work responsibilities. Or perhaps you might have lost work as this is unfolding. But it's also giving us a great opportunity to go deep within ourselves, to really investigate how are we handling this? What happens when we are pushed beyond our limits? Do we fall back into our egoic nature? Or do we operate from a sense of equanimity, from a sense of knowing, if you will, that not only are we human, we're also divine. Divine is a word that's a little bit more, you hear that more from a more Judeo-Christian approach, not necessarily from a Zen approach or a Buddhist approach, but it's the word I'm going to use in this context. What I find really fascinating about what's going on is we call this the coronavirus. Corona, crown. We have this microscopic little apparent organism that is bringing humanity at the moment to its knees. It's disrupting everything. And we still don't know how bad it's going to get. Things might peak maybe in a week or two, maybe not, maybe longer. We have no idea when businesses are going to be able to operate again. Schools in many states, I believe Idaho as well, but their face-to-face schools are canceled for the rest of the year. And so I bring this up in the context of the story of Jesus. Because Jesus taught that the kingdom of heaven is right here with us. We are the kingdom of heaven. We are the divine manifested as human beings. And the goal is really to recognize that, to transform, to awaken to our true nature. And then once that's understood, to embody that, to live our lives in that way. And so Jesus' story, as Adyashanti presents it here, is a map of awakening. And he talks about different stages: the calling, the awakening, trials and tribulations, abiding tranquility, the transfiguration, relinquishment or surrender, and then the transmutation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these different stages, right? The calling is kind of the first one. It's the spiritual impulse. It's what called you to some type of spiritual practice. Now, in the story of Jesus, they don't really talk about this too much, but we know that Jesus really first showed up. And by the way, Adyashanti and myself included, he pulls largely from the Gospel of Mark, a little bit more from Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, which was found, I think, as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1945. Right? But the spiritual calling is when we realize that there's more to life than what we think there is. We just know there's something more. We want to know what it is. We're open to the mystery of our lives. For me, I recognize it going back to early childhood. Maybe it's just something that never left. Well, actually, it did leave. But there was a realization. There was more to life than this. And eventually, I fell prone to the conditioned patterns of our world and the belief systems of my parents and the church in which I grew up and culture. But it was still always unconscious, and eventually in my early 20s, it kind of bubbled back up to the surface and never really left. And it's been a long journey. I mean, I'm in my mid-60s. It's been a long journey, but we all have that spiritual impulse, to go beyond what it is that we know. And what was interesting about Jesus' story is, who did he turn to for this? Is he turned to what we know as John the Baptist, who is apparently a fellow living on the outskirts of the fringe of society. He didn't turn to the priests of the time or the temple of his time. He turned to a fellow who was baptizing, who became very well known for baptizing people under the river. And John represents, according to Adyashanti, that unconditioned part of our being. We turn inward. We turn inward to that part of ourselves that is not conditioned by the world, not conditioned by society. The next stage is the awakening. The awakening. This occurs when you realize that you're not who you think you are. You realize your true nature. In Buddhism, it's called true nature. Sometimes the process is called enlightenment, and thus he was enlightened. It's a common phrase in Zen Buddhism. It's waking up. It's an aha moment where you see beyond the confines of your ego and you realize you're not your ego. Doesn't mean you don't have one. We'll talk a little later how we eventually, our ego might go away. But for the most part, there's still an ego, but we're not the ego. We're more than the ego. Right? This is according to the story of Jesus when Jesus was baptized. So I'm going to quote, just as Jesus was coming out of the water, this is according to Gospel of Mark, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. This is a description of Jesus's awakening in the hands of this guy living on the fringe of society. He had a breakthrough. He realized he's not just this human being. He's not who he thinks he is. He's more than that. Right? So what is it like for you to be taken to the edge of the mystery, to be brought to the edge of the abyss? Ultimately, you have to surrender to it. And it's not something the ego can do. We use the ego, we use the mind to bring you to a point where you're given the opportunity to just let go, to let go of all your ideas about what you are, and just recognize that which has always been there. Because what you are is just this. It's always been there. It's never not been there. But we identify with our ideas about who we are, our names, our roles, our ideas, our belief systems, our affiliations. And so we open up. It's a letting go process. And the method that I use, that I've been taught, is called the living method of awakening. And at least is a beginning because it allows you to really first see what you're not. It's a series of sometimes silly exercises that we take you step by step by step, logically, until you realize, oh, I'm not that. In Hindu, it's called neti neti, not this, not that. And then once you see what you're not, then we, again, through an exercise, allow you to see what you are. Now, I already gave you a hint of that, a glimpse of that, hopefully, in the exercise, the facilitation in our meditation. That open, spacious awareness. You're boundless. You're without edges. You're without a center. You're infinite. You're eternal. You're beyond space and time. Our minds operate in space and time. But what we are is beyond space and time. And when you're brought to that point, you have the opportunity to just see it. And sometimes it's just very subtle. It's like, oh. And then for others, it could be because maybe they've held on so long to their ideas that it's a little bit more explosive. You know? Now, from many of the great mystics, regardless of the spiritual tradition, this is often their description of realizing that they are not just human, but divine. We're both human and divine. We are divine beingness manifesting as human beings. In Buddhism, there's a phrase, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Two sides of a coin, per se. In fact, a couple of you have seen this. A couple of you I know have not. So I'm going to demonstrate this here. Okay. So this is a piece of pin art. And if you imagine each of us is one of these pins. And we tend to walk around and we operate from the perspective of that pin. We see every other pin as separate and distinct from us, every other object of perception as not us. And sometimes the first realization is to see that we are part of a much bigger system of eco-consciousness, so to speak. Oneness. Sometimes we refer to this as oneness. We say it's all one thing. It's all interconnected. Oh, we're all part of the one thing going on. But that's still just one side of things. That's the form side of things. If I turn this around, that's the emptiness side of things. That would be the divine side of things. Form, emptiness. Absolute. The absolute basis of reality is a phrase in Zen and Buddhism. Relative, the phenomenal universe. One and the same. You cannot have one without the other. And this is what I was trying to point to in my little meditation, was inside and outside. Inside and outside are the same. All perception arises, we could say, and this is still dualistic, but it's language. It arises within this formless field of awareness. A sound, I could point to maybe a bird over there with my eyes closed. It's taking place within this formless field of awareness. Even the visual sense of space and objects is a lot harder to discern, but where is that taking place? Where is vision taking place? Where is seeing taking place? Seeing is happening. Hearing is happening. Tasting is happening. Smelling is happening. Touch, pressure, temperature, hot, cold, happening. So awakening is that. It's a glimpse. It's a dropping of body and mind. It's a dropping of one's ideas. Next, he talks about the stages, the trials and tribulations. I have another book, also by Adyashanti. He's one of my favorites. He's just so good. He calls it The End of Your World. It's the post-awakening process. What happens in the post-awakening process? Because it's not a one-off. It's not like, oh, you wake up and then, wow, life is grand. Everything's perfect. Life happens the way we think it's going to happen. Well, no, it doesn't. And Jesus's life, right? He went through a period of trials and tribulations. In the beginning, he was out in the desert, and as the story goes, he was out there for 40 days fasting, and Satan shows up and tries to tempt him in various ways. And he just holds on to his awareness of his divinity, and he does not fall for those temptations. But not just in those 40 days, but in his whole life, right up to the very end. The whole crucifixion is a trial itself. And if we think that once we wake up, that life is grand, that's just a misunderstanding, it's an illusion. It's part of the illusion. But what do we do with it? How do we approach it? How do we face the stuff that happens in our lives? How do we face the consequences of this virus? How do we face that? Do we face it from our ego? Do we clench in fear and anxiety and hide? Or do we just relax? I was going to say accept, maybe not the best word, but it's approaching it with equanimity. What can you do about it? Well, if you go shopping, put on a pair of gloves and put on a mask, or take a walk and keep your distance from other people, or, set up your work conditions so you could work online. I mean, yeah, you don't abrogate your human responsibilities, but how do you approach it from here? Like this or like this? And that's really, I'm talking about the next stage. He calls it abiding tranquility. It's an inner strength. Abiding, he also in other books talks about it as abiding awareness. I'm sorry, abiding, I'm just blanking on it, awakening, abiding awakening. There's a sense of conviction. You just know. It's a kind of knowing. It's not an intellectual knowing. It's a heartfelt knowing. Oh, ego still arises, but you can kind of relax. Oh, yes, I'm not that thought. I'm not that emotion. What was interesting, he makes a distinction between uh, the Buddha and Jesus at this point, whereas Buddha is always depicted in meditation. You know, Buddha was always sort of resting as the divine. And Jesus was different. Jesus lived his life as a human being. He experienced those trials. He lived in the world of activity. And if you're familiar with the Oxherding pictures of Zen, there's 10 pictures that kind of also depict stages of enlightenment and stages of awakening. The very last picture is not one of awakening. It's not even one of oneness, or it's not even one of emptiness. It's a man on an ox riding it back into town, into the village, living his life in complete harmony, in complete equanimity, as with life living itself through this manifested human being. So you will go through challenging times. You might be going through some challenging times right now. But rest in that open, spacious awareness that you already are, that you has always been. My teacher, Fred Davis, calls it unborn, unbound, and untouched. That part is not born or dies. The human is born and dies. The body appears to be born and die, but that divine aspect of ourself is not born and does not die. Unborn, unbound, not constricted, untouched. It's like letting everything roll off your shoulders because nothing bothers that divine aspect of yourself, the true nature of yourself. He talks about next the transfiguration, and I want to be mindful of some time here. This apparently occurs when he goes up to the top of the mountain with 3 of his disciples, and somehow he becomes radiant light. And the 3 disciples kind of demonstrate some fear and bow down, and they don't know what's going on. And what this is really personifying is a deeper awakening. Awakening is not just a one-off, as I've mentioned. I mean, you can really go deeper in this. And what the transfiguration that apparently occurs up on the mountaintop is another form of awakening, a much deeper. And it often signals another stage in one's life. there's something more. And can be very disruptive in many respects, because maybe the old way of doing things no longer applies. The old ways of interacting does not apply. I'm going to skip through some of that stuff, but there's more of an embodying. And what's really happening is clearing. We like to think of this whole process as awakening, clearing, and then embodying. Or Adyashanti says, you wake up, you clear up, and you show up. And the transfiguration process is more clearing up so that more of the divine comes through and you live your life not from a sense of ego, not from a sense of self, but a sense of coming from the true nature, really resting and abiding as your true nature. Then this next stage is relinquishment. And in the story of Jesus, this is partly the story of the crucifixion, but it also starts during the Seder dinner that they're holding. It's Passover. Passover started on Wednesday. It goes for 8 days. And it started, and he was having what we now know as the Last Supper. But ultimately, it's the crucifixion here is representative of the death of the ego, the true dying away. Because the ego is always present, but this is really in Zen known as when you die before you die. Or sometimes it's, you must die on the cushion. You're talking about this. You're killing off the ego. Now, that doesn't mean there's no personality still there. Doesn't mean you still don't interact with the world. But now there's almost a complete letting go of the whole egoic function, the identity. Maybe it's more of a dropping completely of one's identification with the ego. Complete dropping of that identification, because the ego is just a mind function. That's all it is. It's a mind function. It keeps us safe in this world of space and time. We have to eat. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to do things for our biological survival, but it's still just a mind function, and there's a letting go of that. So the crucifixion here, as Adyashanti talks about it, is a symbolic representation of that type of dying. That's what Jesus is showing us, is you too can die to your own divinity without bodily dying. Now, in this case, he does die physically. But we don't have to. All the spiritual teachers say the same thing. We don't have to die physically in order to die. Die before you die. It's interesting. So I want to just briefly point out, as Adyashanti talks about how at the Last Supper, his disciples are falling asleep, and he goes and he prays, and he wants his disciples to wake up, but he goes and prays. And at this point, he's still holding on to his humanity. It's like he's basically asking God, please don't, you take this cup from me. Don't make me go through this. And then he says, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. In other words, I surrender to you. And as I read the story, and I'm not a biblical scholar, by the way, so I'm just pulling this material from Adyashanti, but as he's going through this, he does this 3 times. 3 times his humanness is holding back. I don't want to do this. And then finally he says, I give up. I'll do what you want. And then the last stage, so to speak, is the transmutation. And the way Now, this is still a continuation, he's now on the crucifix, and right before he dies, he calls out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And he screams and dies. The way this is described by Adyashanti, his interpretation of this is not just the death of the ego. That death of the ego already happened. This is the death of the self. And he sees these two things as different, because the death of the self here is a letting go entirely of any sense of separation between the sense of oneself having a relationship with enlightenment, with God, with awareness, with anything. It's a complete dropping, total annihilation of separateness. And this is non-duality. This is the last picture in the 10 ox herding pictures. There's no separation between who you are and what happens to you, between life and you. In fact, there's no more you. It's just life. It just is. It's not even life. It just is. It is. And it's an entirely different way of operating. There's not even a smidgen of self left. Liberation, enlightenment in kind of its purest form. And then there's the resurrection, which interestingly, and there's a lot there, I don't want to go into all of it, but it's in essence, even after that, there's a returning to being human again. Now, there's a lot of different ways the story can be interpreted, so one of the reasons why I want to stay away from it. But one interpretation is that, it's also recognizing inherently that there's still a human life to be lived. Right? Right? So what does this mean for us? Why am I even doing this? Well, it's the Easter weekend. We got a virus going around. A couple of you have had sessions with me. Right? Point is, how do you live your life? Have you woken up? Have you seen clearly what it is you're not? Have you had an awakening experience where you see what it is you are? The irony is, when you see what it is you are, there's no words to describe it. You are just this. Just this. We have our human aspect. We have our divine aspect. Here's a sense of oneness, phenomenal universe. Here's that open, spacious awareness that has no form, no edges, no boundaries, no center. I love this form, emptiness, relative, absolute, human, divine, universe. We don't know what this is, but that's what we are. Have you experienced that for yourself directly? How do you live your life having experienced that? I guess I've been talking for quite a while, so I'm going to stop there. I just realized I had my microphone on my desk the whole time. Can you guys still hear me? I bet you it's coming in better now. Of course, I recorded that whole thing and my microphone was on the desk. So I'm going to stop recording now.